For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for more updates.
Did you know that the Indian economy was ranked 13th in the world in 2000-2001? Today, it is number 5. Did you know that in 2000-2001, India's per capita income was $442? Today, it has grown five-fold to $2,600. Hello and welcome to another edition of Capital Calculus. I'm your host, Anil Padmanabhan. Last week, the Central Statistical Office put out the official estimates for India's GDP or Gross Domestic Product for 2023-24. It was a shocker, a pleasant one at that. It revealed that India's rate of growth of GDP in 23-24 will be a very, very impressive 7.3%, taking the size of the economy to 3.6 trillion at the end of March. A few weeks earlier, the Reserve Bank of India said something similar. In its latest credit policy review, it raised the growth forecast from 6.5% to 7%, while maintaining inflation at the same levels that it had projected earlier, implicitly suggesting that the surge in growth or the increase in growth will not come about at the cost of inflation. Independently, Axis Bank put out a similar forecast. They said all of these things and something more. According to Axis Bank, India was poised to enter a new growth trajectory, one that is 7%, not the 6% previously. The latest numbers suggest that Axis Bank may actually be on the money. Indeed, this happens, it's going to be a game changer. For one, it will accelerate the ongoing makeover of the Indian economy. Just to give you one example, the target of 5 trillion set for 2030 will happen much earlier if this growth trajectory is maintained. To unpack all this and more, we spoke to the chief economist of Axis Bank, Neelkant Mishra. Neelkant is one of the most astute observers of the Indian economy and also a member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. I began by asking Neelkant about this new growth prospects for India. Was he surprised?
I was not. In fact, I have been saying for a while that the recovery post-COVID is going to be better than what most people think. And the fact that India's trend growth assumptions had been brought down too low. If you recall, in 2011-12, everyone thought that India would grow at 8% a year without any stimulus or so through the cycle, the trend growth was going to be 8%. As the decade progressed, we found that those numbers were reduced. So if you recall, people had started bringing down to about 6.5% or maybe less than that as well. And then there was this fear that because of the scarring in the economy post-COVID, that we would see an even lower growth rate. In fact, as we entered FY24, there were people with growth forecasts of 4.8. And I was of the view that growth looks like it will be well above 7. And so it has played out like that. And that's actually, to me, it's not surprising because the capital investment cycle is now starting to turn. And we can dip into that if that's of interest. But I think on both sides, real estate, which was in India, is emerging from a 10-year downturn, as well as the private sector capex, where the deleveraging is mostly over, and we haven't invested in several sectors. Just to end the point and to summarize it, see, there are 3 parts to GDP growth, right? So there is labor input, there is capital input, there is total factor productivity growth. Labor input, to a large extent, is very steady, predictable. How many workers are joining the workforce is more or less known. How many years of education they have is also somewhat smooth. Total factor productivity growth can be volatile, but over a 5-year period, the diffusion of technology, the build-up of infrastructure, those things make things a bit more steady. The cyclicality comes from capital formation, the pace of capital input, and that had slowed down substantially by 2019. In fact, it had fallen to the levels last seen in the late 90s. So now we are seeing a pickup in capital formation, and therefore I think trend growth assumptions will get bumped up to about 7% or so.
So, obvious follow up, Neelkant, is India on the growth turnpike in that case?
It is. So compared to, and on a relative basis, even more so. So the real estate cycles in Germany, in the UK, in US, of course, very famously in China, have been very strong and robust for many decades. In some cases, 2.5 decades, like in Australia, and now they're starting to turn down. And when that happens, of course, the overall economy. So one of the reasons that Germany is struggling and is possibly already in recession is not just the high cost of energy and the problems with their manufacturing, but it's also about a turn down in the real estate sector. In India, that's a very important sector. In fact, we had estimated that the downturn in the real estate sector had been a drag on growth of more than 1% a year between 2012 and 2019. So the fact that that drag is over means that growth starts to pick up.
Now, while Neelkant has given us logic and evidence about his optimism, but still, I was dogged by this fear of deja vu. India is flattered in the past to only deceive. So, why would this time be different?
No, it's a very important question. We need to be very cautious when we make these projections. And so if you look back, so actually the growth disappointment it really hit us after 2012. It was 2008, of course, in the global financial crisis. I think the India was one of the outliers in terms of not having seen a very bad impact. And that was because of this massive increase in the pay commission salaries, which damaged our fiscal condition. So by 2012, it was looking clear. And to be honest, I used to get very frustrated around that time that everyone said, oh, we'll grow at 8%. I said, look, 8% growth is not a given. You need to continue reforming, you need to be very disciplined. And if you looked at the balance sheet of India around that time, it was looking very stretched. So this is what I call the balance sheet model of forecasting. That you can be running at a certain pace, but or you can be driving a car at a certain pace, but are your tires burning out? Do you have fuel in the tank? Is it that you've already run a marathon? Can you run another one? And that's where the state of the body, the state of the economy, the balance sheet of the economy becomes very important. In 2012, we were starting to incur very high current account deficits. We were starting to have very high fiscal deficits. The leverage levels in many business groups was just going out of whack. I remember my colleague and at CS we had put out this House of Debt report where we looked at the 2012 balance sheets, and 8 out of those 10 companies and 10 groups don't exist anymore. So banks had actually gone on a limb and had lent too heavily. If you look at the situation today, it couldn't be more different. So our net international investment position, while it is still negative, as a percentage of GDP has corrected quite a bit. We have assets to equity ratio in the banks and the non-banks at very low levels, meaning that they are very well capitalized. So if there is a demand for debt, I think they are very well positioned to service that. And the corporates, partly because of the fear that was induced by the insolvency and bankruptcy code and the fact that no one was left untouched, or very few people, I mean, the largest of business groups lost assets, has meant that everyone started to deleverage. And we have deleveraged too much. So we are starting to see now that we need new capacity, like in power, for example. I mean, in October, we hit the peak load, and for the first time in many years, we had to see power cuts. So, so the balance sheet side looks far better than it did in 2012, even though the growth rates at that time were higher. And that makes me think that and that the risk of a significant disappointment is much lower. I wouldn't say that there is no risk of disappointment. Remember that the global environment still remains very choppy. Export growth of both goods and services is still slowing. My fear is that a lot of what is happening in the US, the positive growth surprises, is driven by a fiscal stimulus. In fact, in the first 2 months of this fiscal year, October and November, for the US, their fiscal deficit is up 14% year on year. Right. So, and people keep celebrating that, oh, look, there is no recession in the US and every forecaster was wrong. Yes, every forecaster was wrong. But the costs of that fiscal stimulus, even if it's unintended, are going to show up at some point, and that will drive a much steeper correction in external demand, and that's going to be very bad. So I think some of those concerns are there, which is why we think that FY25 growth rates is likely to slow. So we can be growing below trend at maybe at a 6.5% rate in FY25.
Okay, so Neelkant, one key link in this story of recovery and growth is the private investment. So far, government investment is literally pulling the growth trajectory, which is not sustainable because of two reasons. A, fiscally, you cannot fund it. Secondly, the proportion of government investment in total investment is very negligible. So this gorilla in the room, you did signal that you're seeing some incipient trends. How hopeful are you that private capital investment will finally take off?
Correct. So it should have started recovering in 2019-20, but then COVID hit because there were lots of shocks to the economy, lots of corrective measures between 2015 and 2019, including RERA and insolvency and bankruptcy code, and then demonetization and introduction of GST. So they were very disruptive. In fact, one phrase I used to use at that time was India is a house under construction, right? So there will be mess, there will be dust around, you will struggle. Was why did we do this? We were happy with the old home, and so it's only when the new build starts and when the new build ends that you actually get some comfort and clarity on what the growth trajectory is going to be. So no, I think that the private sector capex, the private sector capex is driven by many variables, but two primary variables, right? The first is where is utilization. So if the utilization is at 70%, and the second variable is, of course, what is your expected growth rate, and this expected growth rate is 6%, then you say, you know what, I have enough capacity to fund the next 5 years, and so there is no urgency to do capex right now. But then you see, say, utilization going to 75%, and your trend growth assumption goes from 6 to 7, and you say, oh God, now only I have 3.5%, 3.5 years of spare capacity left, and therefore I need to start investing because it'll take 2 years, 2.5 years to bring capacity up, and what if growth surprises even more? And then one or two companies in an industry do that, and the rest of the country companies then say, oh God, they are investing. We'll start losing market share. So they start investing. And that investment itself then triggers an acceleration in GDP growth. And then it sort of keeps. This is why economic cycles occur, right? Which is why you'll never see a very smooth trend in economic growth unless you're China. And we are starting to see signs of that. So for example, you see, year-on-year growth of 10-12% in cement, and companies really have to rethink whether they need some capacity 3 years out or 5 years out, and they need to start planning for that. And the moment they start planning and investing in that, some of their competitors start to respond, and that investment itself then supports growth. So I think we're at the early stages of this reversal, where the deleveraging cycle. Like think about power, right? Power is a very classic example. So thermal power capacity. There was a time in 2008, 9, 10 when our thermal power capacity was about 130 gigawatts, and we were at that point in the process of adding 200 gigawatts of thermal power capacity. Now, that means that your GFCF, the gross fixed capital formation, the broadest measure of investment in the economy, was at a very high level. And then it could only correct because that was unsustainable. Similarly, in steel, we had 45 million tons of steel capacity, and we were at that point constructing 60 million tons of steel capacity. Now, even if it takes 4 5 years to build, it shouldn't take that long, but it used to. This will create overcapacity for many years, and this is exactly what happened, right? So many, and steel, of course, also suffered from China, but in power, we saw utilizations dipping below 60%, and many of the power plants just became unviable, and so they had to go bankrupt. Now, what we are seeing is that after 8 9 years of almost no investment in thermal power, we are now starting to hit the limits. Now, power is a sector where demand tends to be very volatile, meaning there is an average plant load factor utilization, and then there is a peak plant load factor, which is utilization, which is sometimes 10 12% higher than what the average is. So in October in last year, we actually hit the peak PLF at the ceiling, and therefore there were blackouts, and short-term power tariffs just went through the roof. I think we could hit that again in March when the heat waves restart, and pre-election all states will not want to give blackouts. And so guess what happens? Some of these thermal power plants will become very profitable, and then all investors will start jumping into it. The last gold rush in thermal power was because one power plant, and you will remember which one it was, had delivered its had returned back its capital investment in 1.5 years. Remember, these are 25-year projects, or these plants last 25 years, and this one plant had delivered its cost of capital within 1.5 years, and that led to a massive gold rush. And I'm not saying there'll be a gold rush again. It shouldn't be, because thermal power has its end use date. But I wouldn't be surprised if in March April we see another wave of projects starting to come through.
A striking aspect about the growth forecast by RBI and Axis Bank is that it will not stoke inflationary pressures. Why?
Okay, so inflation is when you start growing above what your trend growth is, and it occurs because your demand is overshooting supply, and it generally occurs when your either monetary conditions are too loose, or your fiscal deficit is expanding rapidly, right? So and both of these are effectively borrowing growth from the future. Right now we have fiscal deficit dropping, and it is if the government sticks to its target of 4.5% by FY26, we will see continued consolidation going forward. And MPC has kept interest rates very high, and so real rates are now after a while in positive territory, and we are also seeing very tight liquidity conditions, so that credit growth is effectively capped. So with these kind of liquidity conditions, you can't grow credit anymore, which means that now companies will have to start rationing out credit. So the economy, when it is running like that, it is very hard to see core inflation accelerate. There is a third factor there, which is that the the economy is still about 1.2 years behind where it should have been if COVID had not occurred. So there are, as we measure the recovery post COVID, the first level, of course, is whether you cross the pre-COVID level of GDP of output, which we did very easily because we are growing much faster. But even today, we are 1.2 years behind where we should have been if COVID had not happened. In that sense, we have now caught up to the world. So the world saw a much faster recovery, but that was primarily because of massive fiscal stimulus in the US and Europe. We didn't give any, or we didn't give too much. And so now we've caught up. So the world is now slipping away from the pre-pandemic path, but we are now catching up to the pre-pandemic path. But we are still 1.2 years behind, which means that on critical things like labor, there is still a lot of surplus available, which is why you are seeing that labor still does not have pricing power. Which is why you're not seeing, demands for massive wage growth across the economy. And so those are the reasons why I think this growth acceleration, which is where the bump up in trend growth assumptions is a much stronger statement that if you keep growing at 7, you're not going to see core inflation pick up. But at the same time, we need to be very cautious on the food side.
It was in 2004 that Vijay Kelkar, the then advisor to the finance minister of India, told a room full of investment bankers in New York that India was poised on a growth turnpike and they should look very favorably towards India. Indeed, his prophecy did hold true. For the next 5 years, India's growth took off at unprecedented levels. In fact, in 1 year it clocked 10%. But all of this came crashing in 2008, which is why a feeling of deja vu when once again we speak of a growth turnpike for India. However, all the key stakeholders, whether they be the Union Government, the Reserve Bank of India, private analysts, and global investors most of all, believe this time it's different. Evidence seems to support their optimism. A happy convergence of physical, social, and digital infrastructure has created the ability for India to do public good at staggering scale, lifting 415 million people out of poverty in 15 years, banking 511 million Indians in a span of 10 years, is just a few examples that I'm sharing with you. Clearly, millions of Indians can ready for better times to come, or what some called Achhe Din. Fingers crossed though. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to Stratnews Global on YouTube. Hit the bell icon so that you don't miss any updates, and please to share your thoughts, ideas and suggestions. I'm available on Twitter at Capital Calculus. I'll be back next week with another episode. Till then, stay safe.
For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Did you know that Karnataka is among the few states in the country that has achieved saturation in allotting cooking gas connections? This includes the poor. Did you know in the just concluded election, inflation, particularly cooking gas prices, was the second most important reason for the people to vote for the Congress? Hello and welcome to another edition of Capital Calculus. I am your host Anil Padmanabhan. Last week, Karnataka elected a new government when its electorate handed a comprehensive win to the Congress party. The subtext of this high-stakes electoral battle is equally significant. The run-up to the election uncovered a new touch point for inflation: cooking gas prices. You heard right. Traditionally, staple items like onion and potatoes, or what we locally call aloo pyaz, have been the pain points. Not in this instance. This forced the Congress and the BJP to promise relief if elected to power. Seen another way, this pain point or new touch point for inflation also uncovers the fact that the aspirational quotient of the people of Karnataka has witnessed a significant jump. What are the consequences? To answer this and more, we spoke to Ashok Lahiri, economist turned politician. The former chief economic advisor is the BJP MLA from Balurghat in West Bengal. Though it has peaked, the current bout of inflation is troubling. For one, it is beyond the comfort level of even the Reserve Bank of India. Two, it has gone on for too long. Remember, inflation shrinks the purchasing power of households. The obvious question is whether it is now such a point of concern for incumbent regimes readying for elections.
Indeed, WPI inflation was in double digits in each of the 18 months of April 2020-21 to September 2022, but it came down smoothly from 10.6% in September 22 to 1.3% in March 2023. Further, CPI inflation has been in single digits in each of the 17 months. This should not be seen too negatively, as you have pointed out. The world has been witnessing high inflation. For example, even low inflation UK is witnessing 6.8%, Germany 6.2%, and France 5%. Now, what is the importance of inflation? See, inflation, unlike growth, touches everyone's life. When the country's per capita income at current prices grows by 10%, your income may not grow by 10%. But when prices goes up, it goes up for everyone. Inflation is not just an esoteric number, but something that you experience in the market in real life. There is also selective retention of information. You only remember that the price of milk has gone up and conveniently forget that the prices of vegetables have gone down. Inflation becomes a hot topic in elections when the economy is not doing too well and you are out of a job or have not managed to secure a raise in salary, and the opposition makes it a hot topic for criticizing the incumbent government. So indeed, I think in the current situation, in all elections, inflation will be played up by the opposition.
In the case of Karnataka, it is clear that it has discovered a new touch point for inflation. The voters have signaled that it is cooking gas prices. The obvious question is, what does it tell us about the aspirational quotient of the voter?
I don't know. Perhaps I look at it positively. This shows the growing income of the average Indian household. The amount that you spend on potatoes and onions, or aloo and piyaj as you say, is a fraction of the amount that you spend on cooking gas. And in a meal you may or may not eat aloo or piyaj, but you'll definitely need cooking gas. So as they say, it's an universal intermediate in the kitchen. Moreover, it is an emotional issue for the average woman who runs the household and manages the family's budget. Furthermore, there is an unhappy history. Perhaps unfortunately, the cooking gas business is a near monopoly of the public sector oil companies. So the expectation is, why can't you reduce the prices? It's not some Agarwal or Jhunjhunwala or Lahiri who is selling this. It is your companies. But the problem is, we have seen the plight of political parties who win the elections by promising to reduce the price of cooking gas and then find it extremely difficult to do so because of the elevated international price of LPG, and meet the budgetary requirements of development expenses as well as the need for fiscal prudence. So it's very easy to criticize, but what you will do about it, I mean, of course, you can say reduce taxes. You can reduce taxes, but you will need taxes for education, health, defense, infrastructure. So, to come back to your question, yes, it shows the growing income of the average Indian household.
Keep in mind that even the poor in Karnataka now have access to cooking gas. Clearly, it is no longer a badge of entry into the middle class club. So, obvious thought is that is this triggering a structural makeover in the consumption patterns in Karnataka?
Yes, we are. But having said that, I'll ask you to keep in mind that there is a distinction between number of connections and consumption. See, connection is a necessary condition for consumption. If you do not give connections, there can't be any consumption. An LPG issue is important from three interrelated points of view. First is the issue of convenience. For a poor household, collecting solid fuel, lighting a chula, cooking is an extremely arduous task. I remember from my childhood days. I mean, if you wanted a cup of tea, the chula had to be lit. It involves considerable amount of time and effort. Second is the issue of health. The smoke emitted by burning of solid fuels is a health hazard and well known for causing respiratory problems. Third is the issue of environmental pollution. LPG in household kitchen can save trees and also cut down on carbon emissions. Now, remember the Modi government in May 2016 launched the Pradhan Mantri Ujjwala Yojana. And as you have pointed out, in Karnataka there is saturation, but even all over the country, the target was 8 crore liquefied petroleum gas connections to poor households by March 2020. And the target was met on 7 September 2019. Now that's a great thing. The problem is the economically weaker sections buying LPG cylinders as refills. So I'll tell you, maybe it's not a very popular thing to say. I think we need to distinguish between who needs a subsidy and who doesn't. And that is where targeting becomes very important. Because ultimately, when you say increase the subsidy on this, you never answer the question, do you want the fiscal deficit to go up? Or do you want to cut expenditure on education, health, infrastructure? What do you want? They'll never answer that question. People who ask for a subsidy. Now, the issue is, how do you target the economically weaker sections? DBT is a good solution. But again, what I was finding is that this has run into the problems of when and how to give it, before or after recovering the installment due for provision of the LPG connection. Now, see, politics is extremely competitive, and politics has become something like advertising. Advertising has become an art. There are many products which you're not aware of to begin with. But once you see the glitzy advertisement, you not only become aware of it, but start feeling that they're indispensable. They're a necessity.
Implicit in what Ashok Lahiri just said is that the aspirational quotient of the electorate of India, particularly of people in Karnataka, has grown.
Growing aspirations is something that I'm delighted about. Because first you have to aspire, and then only you will achieve what you aspire for. And these growing aspirations that you're talking about are not only about affordable prices of cooking gas, but also, and perhaps more importantly, about faster growth, employment opportunities and development. I'm delighted when I see that the demands are not only for roti kapra makan, but is about bijli sarak pani. Now, it will be too simplistic to take today's electoral verdict against the incumbent BJP government as a vote against the elevated LPG prices. The opposition campaigned on multiple issues of corruption and poor infrastructure. And there were also issues, unfortunately, of fractured electorate in terms of castes. And I'm sorry, I'm detracting a little, but since 1985, every time Karnataka has voted against the incumbent government. But coming back to your aspirations question, as I have argued in my book, India in Search of Glory, growing aspirations of the electorate is a great source of strength for Indian democracy. Why do I say this? Now, you will recall, you may have heard that the political scientist famous Anthony Downs have said, politicians do not win elections to formulate policies. They formulate policies to win elections. Indian electorate has become aspirational. They want faster growth and development, better living standards. So the Indian politicians will have to increasingly respond more efficiently to meet this aspiration. And I think we'll do it. And I don't have any doubts, given our strength of our democracy, that any one or any party which fails to deliver on higher growth and higher living standards and employment will be out of power. So you have to walk the talk and deliver what you promised before the election.
One interesting trend witnessed in Karnataka is the growing convergence between rural and urban consumption patterns.
See, there is convergence, but I haven't looked at the consumption surveys, NSA's consumption surveys. I'll be surprised if the gap hasn't narrowed. Particularly when I go to my constituents and go to very rural areas, you'll be surprised at the range of consumer products that you can get even in a relatively backward village or rural, what we call in Bengali, heart, the rural market. So, and this has happened particularly with the spread of the television and the internet. Now, people know about shampoos, toothpaste, all sorts of consumer durables. In one of the villages I went to, near the border, I saw a washing machine being carried to a village home. So there is convergence, but what is the distance as yet? I mean, a distance now, I can't give you a good idea. But I think in terms of availability, it has improved tremendously, particularly with Gram Sadak Yojana. Now you can, it's not that difficult. You don't have to walk 5 kilometers to reach a village. So things can reach easily. So the both these, the aspirational aspect as well as convergence between rural and urban areas are two important developments in recent times. And the convergence is also partly because that a boy from my village or a girl from my village has gone to Bangalore or Mumbai or Kolkata and is working there. So they know the ways of the urban folks. And they educate me and I sort of I transcend my consumption pattern, and my consumption pattern starts looking more like urban areas, Latin urban areas.
Are we looking at a point of inflection in India's political economy?
So what has happened is that I go to the rural areas and see the rural self-government, the panchayat samiti, Zilla Parishad. Now, it's not a state secret that money is wasted and there is leakage. Now, what has happened is that an enlightened electorate are asking questions. What did you do with this money? Where did you build the road? Now, similarly, you have DBT is making it more difficult for people to steal money. So governance, I'm sure, with an educated population and RTI, governance will improve, has to improve. And it's a very vibrant democracy. People may be quiet for some time, but they will vote with a vengeance. They will vote for good governance. And here, where my hope comes is that when you have a fractured verdict, that's not a good thing. Now, starting from the decade of the 80s was coalition politics. Sometimes we even thought that maybe we have to live with this coalition politics for a long time. But now the aspirational and better educated India is giving clear verdicts. Political parties have no longer the alibi that is the coalition compulsion. That has gone. So I don't see how, with a better educated population and aspirational set of people, politicians will have any option but to deliver better governance.
It isn't clear that the Karnataka election has uncovered a big bump in the aspirational quotient of the voter. It is a marvel as to how quickly aspirations take flight once you provide the wherewithal. The voter today wants a better standard of living and is not happy with compromises. To woo these voters, political parties are now pushing the boundaries of populism. Some fear that competitive populism is here. This will come, of course, at a fiscal price. It means diverting resources away from national priorities like providing drinking water, housing, education, and so on. As they say, there are no free lunches. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to Strat News Global on YouTube. Hit the bell icon so that you don't miss any updates. And please do share your thoughts, ideas, and insights with us. I'm available on Twitter at Capital Calculus. I'll be back next week with another episode. Till then, stay safe. Did you know that India signaled its ideological pivot away from socialism to market-based reforms in 1980? This was captured in the 6th five-year plan presented in 1980. And did you know that the member secretary of the Planning Commission then was Manmohan Singh? And now the wow fact. Did you know, in the concluding session of the 17th Lok Sabha, Prime Minister Narendra Modi presented a strong defense of economic reforms. It's the first time, especially one from a government that is facing two-term anti-incumbency, is making such a strong defense of economic reforms. Hello and welcome to another edition of Capital Calculus. I am your host Anil Padmanabhan. Last month, addressing the concluding session of the 17th Lok Sabha, Prime Minister Narendra Modi did something unthinkable, which is not part of any politician's playbook. He's put up a strong defense of economic reforms and then went on to argue that it was a guiding principle of his government. And identified it as reform, perform, transform. This was no one-off. Earlier, the President's address to both Houses of Parliament, as well as the white paper presented by Nirmala Sitharaman to both Houses of Parliament, put up a similar defense of economic reforms. This government is seeking to link its ability to deliver development for all to the push for economic reforms. All this just weeks before the general election cycle kicks in. Now, no government in the past has dared to approach the electorate with a manifesto that includes a defense of economic reforms. But here, the NDA is seeking to go against the tide, as it were. So what do we make of this dare? Is it hubris, the India shining of 2004, for example? Or is it signaling a mindset reset which has been long in the making? To answer this and more, I spoke to Sanjeev Sanyal. He is an economist and member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. I began by asking Sanjeev his thoughts on the white paper that the government had presented to Parliament.
I think the government's economic views are now reasonably well established, and I think they came through here as well. So, what are the anchoring points about this government's economic views? Because very often the accusation is made that this is a government that's unintellectual. It doesn't have a clear economic framework of thinking. So let me lay out what it is, and also once you read it in the white paper, if you go and relook at it, these are all there clearly laid out. So the first and very important part of this government's economic management strategy is macroeconomic stability. So this is very important because this is the government that inherited, a fragile five economy. It then took the effort to introduce a unambiguous inflation targeting framework. And remember, India was, while it was not an Argentina type high inflation country, it was a high inflation country in the 8 to 12% annual rate kind of level. It then anchored it in the 2 to 6% range. And since then, if you see that inflation has by and large been in this range, on two occasions going below it and one occasion going above it, but basically staying inside this range. Now, that is a 500, 600 basis point reduction in the underlying inflation rate. That's not a trivial thing to do. Similarly, if you see the cleaning up of the banking system. So, the banking system that was inherited by this government had serious NPA problems. Even Raghuram Rajan acknowledges that. And then starting from 2017, 18, and 19, this was cleaned up. I mean, I myself was very much a part of that cleanup effort when I was at the finance ministry. And it was cleaned up using the insolvency and bankruptcy code. Bringing it was not, so it's partly a macroeconomic stabilization issue and partly a structural reform. So, it created the framework for creative destruction as well. The similarly accumulation of foreign exchange reserves. There's been continuous accumulation of foreign exchange reserves. They now stand somewhere in the range of $620 billion. Even at the height of COVID, you would have seen that this government didn't go out there and use up all the fiscal and monetary resources. It was quite judicious about its use. So you can see that one article of faith is macroeconomic stability. And that is one of our strengths today. At the end of 10 years, you can see that, not only is it stable, but there are lots of buffers that have been created in different directions for unintended and unpredictable situations. So whether it's foreign exchange reserves or the capitalization of the banking system, or even bringing down the fiscal, even, in the middle of an election year, you are still article of faith. So you're still doing fiscal consolidation through that. So this is one big area. The second very big area is this is a government that is unapologetically supply-sider. So while we do demand management to some extent, but it is done from a macroeconomic stability perspective. It is not, demand management is not seen as the way to generate growth. The way it is done is by creating capacity. So whether it is an ease of doing business or trying to attract foreign investors here, PLI scheme, building of infrastructure, opening up sectors like, a whole bunch of sectors that have been opened up in the last few years, from drones to space. So all of it is about ease of doing business, getting the supply side responsive and so on. So this is the growth engine part. So stability part, there's the growth engine part, and it's unapologetically supply side. We are not the guys who massage demand to generate growth. Okay. And the third article of faith of this government is that something has to be done for the bottom. So this is the point about Antyodaya. Antyodaya means the rise of the people at the bottom. Now notice that this is fundamentally different concept than, say, the Western idea of inequality. So we are not socialists. We have no problem with billionaires. There's no point in telling us Adani, Ambani, and so on. Our view is, look, India has 1/6 of the world's population. We should have 1/6 of the world's billionaires. However, we do need to help the people at the very bottom, and directly doing so. This is not an inequality thing. It is a targeting of absolute poverty. And so you see what is being done. You provide them with safety nets with health insurance. You help them build up their houses, ghar pakka, so the PM Awas Yojana. You make sure the very poorest have toilets, they've got cooking gas, they've got a bank account. And so you can clearly see direct targeting of absolute poverty. So these are the three anchors of economic policy that this government believes in. Supply side, keep the macroeconomic stable, make sure the very poorest people are giving some support directly. And all of this comes through in the white paper.
And I want to draw your attention to the PM's final address in Parliament to the entire House, which is basically a summation of this government's tenure. And he used this very good phrase. He said, reform, perform, and transform is what our government has achieved. So, in my memory, I don't see any government going into a general election owning reforms so proudly. So, are we witnessing some kind of mindset reset in this country finally?
I think absolutely. I mean, so if you go back to like the original reforms of 1991, and if you read the budget speeches of 1992, for example, where Manmohan Singh, is consolidating those original reforms, you can see how apologetic the whole thing is. And in the end of that speech, he says, let the assassins come, so to speak. So he can see that we are doing reforms, but we are not owning them. We are doing them because, look, we have a crisis, the IMF is forcing us to do this, and so on and so forth. And then when Prime Minister Vajpayee comes in, we do privatization, but we give it, this term called disinvestment. So, we we invent all these euphemisms because we are apologetic about the whole thing. Whether it's an intellectual class or our policymakers, even our business community is not entirely comfortable with the business of a market-based, creative destruction-based system. That, I think, has changed. And I think that's where a lot of the momentum comes. Now, one of the ironies is because we own it and we are unapologetic about it, it also means that we may occasionally do things which may be considered non-market interventions. But again, we are unapologetic about that too, because we are more, in a sense, comfortable in our skins about the whole thing.
As you argued earlier, this government has made it a slogan of pro-poor and pro-business and managing to tread both sides. So how was this, how is this managed? I mean, how has this been achieved without major disruptions?
So, of course, some part of it is, top-down messaging from right up there from the Prime Minister himself. So, leadership is one part of it. But one important thing that has happened is that I think we are lucky that we have in place a generation now, particularly young people, who are willing to take some amount of disruption happily if they think that there is a chance that you'll benefit something in the long run from it. Now, this requires a certain civilizational confidence, right? So, for example, whether you take insolvency and bankruptcy and the cleaning up of the banks, a very messy process, a painful thing at some level. Even demonetization or introduction of GST, all of these are disruptive things. And yet, we went through all of them almost simultaneously. In a short period of time, we did all of these things. And we, by the way, also introduced the monetary policy framework, which is it's a deflationary policy. So all of these are painful things to do, which were done in almost at the same time. Then we went through the disruption of COVID as well. And yet, despite some grumbling, as a population and as a people, we took it in the chin and went on. And we are now getting the benefits of it. So it feels good now that we are getting the benefits of it. The fact of the matter is, we all, you, I, the man on the street, all went through this rather disruptive shocks and were willing to take these changes. And I think this is something that cannot be wasted in a sense. We have now a few decades, I think, where the general population is willing to take short-term pain for long-term gain. And that happens very rarely in history. And I think, therefore, the political leadership quite correctly senses it and is pushing through all kinds of reforms.
See, while the mindset reset you have walked us through, but there still seem to be pockets of resistance. Let's take the farm laws, for example, which had to be rolled back. Almost everyone beyond the agitating farmers believed it was good for the farm economy, but it had to be rolled back. Now there's a fresh agitation on MSP. So, Pockets of resistance continue, right? I mean, but is this a cause for worry, or it is just part of the democratic process?
Well, partly it's a part of the democratic process, and so it's fair that we go through it. But I think there is also the problem of what is known as Manker-Olson's collective action problem. That when there is something that is of benefit to a large number of people, but hurts a relatively small group of people who are organized, then very often the small organized group will end up dictating terms, even though there's a very large number of people who benefit. So, so therefore, all reform is based on, either the larger numbers who need to organize themselves, or there has to be a leadership that is willing to take on these interest groups and basically be able to explain why he's doing it. I would argue that this is not a unique problem, by the way, to India. Every place in the world you will have this problem. What is interesting is that there is now a leadership in place and a population in place that is willing to allow these kinds of things to be done. I mean, this is also, after all, introducing the GST was also a very difficult thing. There were winners and losers from that too. There were clear winners and losers from the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. There have been clear winners and losers from every reform we have done, opening up the space sector, opening up the geospatial sector, opening up the drone sector. There were bureaucratic departments that lost power. The Survey of India became, lost its monopoly over cartography and geospatial data. At every stage, there was somebody who lost. But then if you push back hard enough and there is a general support, then things do get done after a few iterations.
Finally, Sanjeev, do you fear that the special interest groups may make a comeback and force a rollback of reforms sometime later, or that tipping point has been crossed?
Well, anything can be reversed. But the point is that I think the tipping point for at least a generation has been crossed. Because we have a generation that is doing things, it is benefiting from it. It's as I said, we are unapologetically reformist and are willing to take some hits and risks for it. Now, it's possible that in some distant future, we will have a softer generation which doesn't have memories of the 70s and 80s and of the pre-liberalization era. You will have these communist socialist type ideas coming back repackaged in some fashion, and they will begin to affect policy. This is what is happening, for example, in the US. I mean, sometimes some of the policies you see being advocated by some US politicians, and you say, you've got to be kidding me. This is what Jyoti Basu would have been proud of. And this is happening in the US. US is a country that was built on the unwillingness to pay taxes. And they've ended up being a heavily taxed country. This kind of thing happens. A different generation may take a different view of things. But for the time being, I think we have a moment in history where whether the popular will, the leadership, and the general direction of things are all aligned.
You heard Sanjeev. He's convinced that there has been a national mindset reset on the idea of economic reforms. People are now willing to accept short-term pain because they are convinced that there is a long-term gain. This mindset reset also reflects a growing trust quotient between people and the government. As you know, the idea of economic reforms was seeded way back in 1980. But most of the years thereafter, it was a case of reforms by stealth. It has taken 40 years for a government to come out so openly in support of economic reforms, and that too before a general election cycle. And further, is a government which is facing a two-term anti-incumbency. Implicitly, therefore, they are seeking a referendum on economic reforms. Indeed, there's much more at stake in the upcoming general election than a record third term for the NDA. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to Strat News Global on YouTube. Hit the bell icon so that you don't miss any updates. And please do share your thoughts, ideas and suggestions with us. I'm available on Twitter, or X as they call it now, at Capital Calculus. I'll be back next week with another episode. Till then, stay safe.
For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for more updates.
Did you know that Russia accounts for 40% of India's crude oil imports? And 3 years ago, this proportion was in single digits. Do you know that India has the fourth largest crude oil refining capacity in the world? Hello and welcome to another edition of Capital Calculus. I am your host, Anil Padmanabhan. In the last 3 years, India's imports of crude oil from Russia have surged. In fact, they now account for 40% of the country's crude oil imports. All this while Russia continues to be under sanctions imposed by the Western bloc of nations. In fact, some call this India's crude oil heist. Significantly, barring the occasional outrage, mostly India has got a pass on its actions, which, on the face of it, defy global sanctions. Why? To understand this and more, we spoke to Harsh Pant, Professor of International Studies at King's College London and one of the foremost experts on strategic affairs. I began with the obvious. How did India pull off this diplomatic feat?
I think, in some ways, this is a reflection of India's growing acceptance in the global order, that it was able to manage the transition from a pre-Ukrainian world order to a post-Ukrainian one, where the fault lines between Russia and the West got sharpened. So I think for India to be in a unique position at that juncture, where it could reasonably make an argument to the West that being an important country for the West, for the Indo-Pacific, for managing the transition that is happening vis-a-vis China, we need to continue to enhance our capabilities. And economically weakened India would be of no use to anyone. So I think that argument in some ways has been very, has been taken on board, and the West has not really been, they have talked about it, their media has written about it. The Western governments have been relatively nonchalant about India's buying oil from Russia and continue to buy oil from Russia. And the other thing that India did, of course, was to highlight the entire hypocrisy of the West, to say that, look, a lot of the countries were so deeply entrenched with Russia economically, and especially in the energy sector, that for them to point fingers at a country like India that was starting from a very low base — Russia was not really India's energy partner before Ukraine, was devoid of any factual basis. So in some ways, facts as well as the growing acceptance of India as an emerging player in the global order helped India navigate this transition. And of course, Russia was in need of partners. So I think India's, I think for Russia to put all its, eggs in Chinese basket would not really have been very prudent. So in some ways, India emerged as an important interlocutor for Russia if it wanted to retain some independence of action vis-a-vis China. It may not really work in the long term, but at least in the short term, it could demonstrate to China that, look, you are not the only country that is taking oil from us. India is there. India played to that. India played to the Western sensitivities on this question. And I think diplomatically pulling this off perhaps has been one of the finer displays of Indian diplomatic acumen that we have seen in recent years. Given that very contrasting and competing interests that different stakeholders have in this issue, India was able to manage and get out of it relatively well. and manage its domestic economic situation very, very well, given the turbulence in the global market. I think that in some ways underscores the governance ability that India has generated over the years in terms of managing both the external and the domestic front. And how increasingly Indian policymakers also realize that there is no distinction between domestic and foreign. What is happening abroad is shaping your national priorities, and what you do domestically reverberate across the world. So I think that has been a very important learning curve for India as well.
Harsh, we'll come back to this diplomatic maneuver in a bit, but I just want to flesh out this, what India has pulled off. Importing cheap crude is one thing, but it is value adding and re-exporting it, and at a pretty good markup, and that too to Europe. So how is Europe taking this entire, exchange that's happening, given that they have to bear the bill of the sanctions against Russia? And barring a few outrages here and there, generally India seems to be getting a pass from Europe too.
Oh yes, I think Europe has been giving India a pass on this issue, and in some ways, I think the over the top reaction that we saw in the initial few months after Ukraine allowed India that space to make a very cogent argument to Europe that, look, Europe is the reason, in some ways, why Russia felt initially it has leverage over Europe. So given how entrenched Russia was in the energy sector, if you look at even at an economy like Germany, it was remarkable how entrenched the relationship was. Now, Germany has actually done very well in terms of reducing that dependence on Russia in a relatively short period of time. But that does not take away from the fact that the entrenchment that Russia had in the energy sector in Europe allowed India and India's claim certain credence that, look, India is of course is starting from a very low base. India is a relatively poor country, but here are countries which are relatively rich, advanced, and countries that that have been enjoying the fruits of Russian energy. Should not really be commenting on a very relatively low base country like India, which is starting off its engagement with Russia on the energy front. So I think the Europeans themselves gave India an opening in the initial few months, and India latched on to it. But I think the other aspect, of course, has been India's communication strategy has been very effective. That India not only publicly told its side of the story, that look, when you point a finger at India, remember that you are also part of this game, but also in some ways convincing Europe that if India were not part of this dynamic, the energy market would really shoot off the roof. That you would have a real problem at your hands if India was not buying Russian oil, and that would in some ways impact Europe, which has been reeling under economic distress. So already there were divisions within Europe about the future of this war, the future of this conflict, how to manage Russia, and the economic costs have been very biting, and there have been concerns how far Europeans can take this on. And I think India's argument that India's role is critical not only for itself, but for the global energy market also assuage some of those concerns. And I think broadly, therefore, when you see Europe and European governments, I would say, have been generally nonchalant, generally positive about India's engagement. We increasingly see this argument that, look, India's ties with Russia are India's business, and how India deals with it is India's business. So I think India has been able to communicate its constraints, its opportunities, and the opportunities that lie therein for Europe in India's opportunities. I think so. There is an interesting tale here that one can weave. That it is, that Europeans have been very pragmatic in this case. They have not been ideological. They have realized that India buying this oil is not only good for India, it is good for the global market.
Harsh is making a very important point here. India has been able to redefine the global perception about it. Is this because of a paradigm shift in thinking, where it sees itself as part of the solution and no longer as a country that is part of the problem?
Yes, I think very fair. I would say that, the whole paradigm shift we are seeing that that, whenever in the past there used to be a crisis, we could raise our hands up in the air and say, oh my God, there's a crisis is coming. What do we do? How do we get out of it? Today, I think looking at those crises as opportunities has become a very interesting phenomenon in Indian diplomacy, in Indian way of thinking, in Indian style of governance. And I think that has given India enormous leverage, whichever way you look at it. And I think this particular case that we are discussing is just one example of that. But there are other examples, and there are plethora of issues on which India has gone ahead and said, look, this is our moment, whether you see it in terms of vaccines, whether you see it in terms of China plus one strategy, whether you see it in terms of semiconductors today. I think this idea that, look, this is our moment. We are, a very important cog in the global economic wheel, and we need to play up to our strengths. And I think this example that we are discussing, the energy crisis, this allowed India that to make that argument that given how important India is becoming in the global energy market, why shouldn't India make this argument that, look, we are not here simply for us, we are also here as a benevolent actor. And I think that is a very interesting way to look at it. For example, Chinese have not made this argument. Chinese are still making this argument that no, it is, they keep on buying all the oil for themselves. And I think despite all the disinformation campaign that they run, their public diplomacy on this issue has been remarkably ineffective, because China is seen as part of the problem, whereas India increasingly is seen as part of the problem, is part of the solution.
There's a method to India's newfound boldness on the diplomatic front. It has a lot to do with its willingness to give and take at the global high table. It is willing today, as a responsible country, to make sacrifices for global good.
Yes, I think that is that narrative somehow is now building up. That for a large part of our history, we were always very good at pointing fingers at others. We were very good at articulating problems, but when it came to solutions, we were missing in action. Part of it is, of course, we did not have the capabilities to make a difference. But today we are more confident. We are confident not only about the challenges we are facing, but the world is facing, and what our role can be, as part of those challenges. And climate change is a very good example. And one has to give credit to the Modi government here in terms of how they brought in a paradigm shift, where, of course, the argument remains that the West and the developed world has to do more on climate finance, more on climate adaptation, and then bringing technologies, sharing technologies that are needed. But I think fundamentally the argument today is that we have to do our bit as well, that we cannot simply shy away from our commitments, from our responsibilities. And that argument has been made very effectively by Indian leadership to the domestic population. Because in the past, the domestic population, the argument that I think policymakers were making to the domestic population was that, you don't worry, our only focus is economic growth. Because that is needed, we are not going to make any changes, and we are going to also push back against Western hegemony or the hegemony of the developed world. I think that narrative has changed. This idea that, look, of course, there are problems that have been created by the West or by the developed world, and they need to shoulder greater responsibility in helping us. But I think the sense that we are making, the argument that we are making to our own people today is, it is our responsibility as well. We need to shoulder some of that burden, and we are willing to move beyond just saying it is your problem. So whether it is taking on commitments that we are doing much better at than many people expected, or even articulating it through global platforms like International Solar Alliance, that this partnerships that we are creating, where we are saying we will solve some of these problems by creating new platforms, by creating new institutions, by taking on more commitments, I think is radically changing the perception of India as a country that also contributes to the global order.
No doubt, India's diplomatic maneuvering deserves credit. Yet, it is also a fact that India was a case of being at the right place at the right time.
Absolutely. I think, and the biggest, help to India, one should send a thank you note to Xi Jinping, because he has been really, the way he has governed China and the way he has managed China's external partnerships, that has given India enormous space to maneuver. And if it were not for China's belligerence, if it were not for the kind of consensus you see on China today in the West and in the Indo-Pacific, I don't think India's space would have been as broad, as wide as it is today. So certainly India is at a very important moment in the way it is transitioning and in the way the global order is transitioning. So I think both together have given India several opportunities. But Anil, in the past also India has had many opportunities that we have missed. We are famous for missing several buses in the past. So I think there is even today there is a challenge. There are so many opportunities. Are we ready for exploiting them? I think the government of the day is saying that they are willing to take certain risks, that they are willing to put the feet on the accelerator and see how far it goes. But I think it is also something that we'll have to, as a nation, think in terms of building our capacities. How far can we mobilize our resources? Because this is a long term game. This is not going to end today or tomorrow. The world is shifting. The parameters are shifting. There is almost a paradigm shift in the way we look at the global order. And India, as you said, happens to be at the right, at the right moment, at the right place. And if Indian diplomacy, if Indian policymakers don't take advantage of this, then I think we will be doing it once again 10 years down the line. So the sense that you get is that I think the policymakers are aware and they are sort of trying to do this, what is perhaps feasible at the moment. But I think as a nation, we need to be more aware of this. So, you often feel there is, even today, a sense of despondency in certain quarters. At the moment you start articulating, that India is doing this, there are 20 people who will tell you how this cannot be done. I think that mentality has always been a problem for India. And that perhaps, to a certain extent, this government has been able to, remove from the discourse. But again, India is a democracy. Tomorrow there'll be another government, and the changes in governments will come and go. But is there a national consensus? And is this moment of time being appreciated by everyone, every stakeholder, not only the government, but also the private sector? How far are they willing to go? Indian private sector has always been very reticent in taking risks, at least abroad. So I think this is a moment for everyone to think through whether we can build institutions that are resilient enough, that can take this, that can utilize this moment to their advantage.
You heard Harsh. India today is exhibiting unprecedented boldness and risk-taking ability on the global stage, even as it continues to strengthen its domestic economy. Combined with deft diplomatic maneuvering, as well as the geopolitical reset, it is helping India redefine the global perception about it. It is transforming from a country which is perceived to be normally part of the problem. Instead, it is now seen as a country which is part of the solution. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to Stat News Global on YouTube. Hit the bell icon so that you don't miss any updates. And if you like the show, please do hit the like button. And please do share your thoughts, ideas and suggestions with us. I'm available on Twitter at Capital Calculus. I'll be back next week with another episode. Till then, stay safe.
For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Did you know that the Vande Bharat was the first Make in India semi-high-speed train? Did you know for the first time an all-woman 29-member crew manufactured and assembled an entire coach of the Vande Bharat? Did you know that Vande Bharat's original name was Train 18? Hello and welcome to another edition of Capital Calculus. I am your host Anil Padmanabhan. On 15 February 2019, the first Vande Bharat Express was launched, connecting Delhi and Varanasi. Indeed, this was less than 2 years after the project had been kicked off. Its success is a story of audacity, grit and determination. At present, 8 trains are operational and the Union government has committed that 400 will be functioning by 2025. Indeed, India's first high-speed rail project is set to revolutionize transport in the country. To understand why and more, we spoke to Sudhanshu Mani. Sudhanshu is a former head of the Vande Bharat project. I began by asking Sudhanshu his first thoughts on the 3rd anniversary of the Vande Bharat Express, especially since it happened under his watch and in record time.
When I say we, I mean I and the capable team at ICF, we had, most of them had this angst that India doesn't have a modern, train, speedier, higher technology, better aesthetics. And we all decided that we will work together to give this to the country. And we were, fortune perhaps favors the brave, we were able to deliver it in record time. And the agencies helped to test it in time as well, roadworthiness. After October 18, it was tested and ready in January and finally launched, as you say, on 15th of February, 2019. So at that stage, of course, we didn't realize that our product is going to be this popular. And in today's context, if you see what's happening, it's a product which is going to change the face of Indian Railways. When I say that very responsibly. 10 trains are already there. A lot more could have been there, but we'll not get into that. The important thing is that, well, the next year, the coming year, may see as many as, let's say, 30, 35 more. And very soon, that means certainly in 2024 sometime, we will have 50 such trains crisscrossing across the country. And that's why I say it's going to change the face of the Indian Railways in the country. And that gives us immense satisfaction. Without me having to go into the merits of the train and so on, its popularity speaks for itself. And the importance given to the train as a symbol of aspirational India by the Prime Minister himself, that he is affording this much respect for the train, that he is going and launching them, each and every train himself. And that's also perhaps the reason, the Prime Minister's interest in the train, that we're going to have these 50 trains very soon. So we never in our wildest imagination had thought that this would have such proliferation. But it feels very good to see that indeed it has changed, as I say, the face of Indian Railways, and many, many more to come.
You heard the man. Vande Bharat will change the face of Indian Railways, but this required a fundamental mindset reset within the railways.
Well, that was very important. Not in respect of the train alone. You see, the organizationally, Indian Railways is, I regret to say, but still it's changing, but gradually still living in colonial times. And there was so much feudal culturally and even structurally, hierarchy-wise. So there's so much of barriers, misplaced propriety, barricades, of protocol and things like that. So that was something I was able to break in the beginning, that I'm convinced that more and more openness, breakage of these protocols, absolute platform for ideation from the lowest rung of workers, that can really transform a railway organization, be it a factory or a zone or anywhere else. So that was a bedrock on which many other things we were able to do in ICF. The biggest visible change, of course, was the train itself. But there's so many areas in integral coach factory that we could actually achieve only through this simple means of very strong bonding of employees among each other at every level, and some kind of a audacity, a little chutzpah to do something new. For example, ICM became the only factory of Indian Railways which is carbon negative, consuming 12.5 megawatt from conventional power and generating 13 megawatt of renewable energy through windmill and solar power. empowerment of women. Women, 29 of them, aged 23 to 57, supervised by a lady officer, making a coach entirely on their own. That and heavy fabrication job. It's not like a desk job or a computer or assembly job. Heavy fabrication job. That was a strong signal to tell the world that respecting all women as equals is not a matter of lip service or a cliche. It has to be demonstrated, and these women were able to demonstrate it, and that for any organization really walking into 21st century is very essential.
Vande Bharat was originally christened Train 18. The story behind the name captures the audacity of this game-changing project.
Well, so once we got this sanction, there were other doubts, challenges, which we are not getting into. There was a large project. One of the things that my team told me is a project of this magnitude, starting with the concept, making it into some kind of a design, then a proper functional design engineering, then to manufacture after the tooling, validate, test. All this is a process which international norm is that it should, if you do it properly and systematically, takes 36 to 42 months. We are in April 17, you are retiring in December 18, giving us 21 months. By the time you retire, we would have completed the drawing work. Manufacture would perhaps not have started. It will be very easy for the next leader to come and say, why are you purchasing this trouble? I mean, who asked you to make this train? You are purchasing unnecessarily problem. If it doesn't work, who will reply? All that kind of doubts, And the project may get abandoned. And then where we would be after excitement of 21 months, it will be such a damn squib. That's when I said that, yes, the concerns are genuine. I know how railways and leaders work. So now let's find a solution. And the solution was we'll try and do something which has not been done anywhere earlier. And that is burn our midnight oil, work timings suited to others, whether in India or abroad. And we will work like donkeys, like Indians can, and turn out this train before I retire. That means in 2018 calendar year itself. And as a reminder to everyone in the team that here is a train we are working on, which is going out of Integral Coach Factory in calendar year 2018. So let's call it Train 18.
I was curious to know as to what makes Vande Bharat so special.
So there's nothing novel as such. If you look at the world, some people even call it an invention. I don't. Yes, but there are many things which are novel for Indian Railways. Number one is the coaches in a train get attached, detached, the locomotive gets attached, detached, brought from one end to another. All that is made unnecessary because there is no locomotive. The coaches are permanently coupled. And all the equipment for driving the train, for air conditioning, for heating, lighting, whatever, everything is under the board. The space above the board is entirely available for passenger amenities, except 2 cabs in the end. So that's, and then that's, the media started calling it engine-less train. Engine in common parlance is the locomotive. So that name has stuck, which is technically incorrect, but still, the USP is this, that the train has no locomotive. It has coaches of all same profile. So the train is amenable for very aerodynamically sleek and elegant design, which we think we were able to do it. So it automatically becomes aesthetically very superior, apart from engineering performance because of aerodynamic profile.
It is not that government departments have not enjoyed success. After all, we have the extremely successful story of ISRO. But the problem is that they are more the exception than the rule. So the big question then is whether Vande Bharat is that tipping point.
Of course, ISRO and of course, Department of Atomic Energy, DRDO to some extent, not entirely, but definitely to some extent. These are the examples of government agencies having delivered near world-class products, which all of us can be proud of. Little caveat here that they work in an environment of perhaps lower intervention of bureaucracy. They work under the PMO, and they also work under the an environment of denial of technology, which means they don't have the option to go to somebody else and beg for technology or purchase technology. Railways have no such problem. So the first instance, if you find a new type of locomotive or train, why don't we import it? That is also a reason why the inherent of railway engineers does not burgeon. Otherwise, the pool of engineers, engineering managers is very, very competent. And it's over the years that their technical competence and the technical excitement to do something starts getting killed because they are not engaged to do something out of the box for the country. But it's there to be tapped. And I realized that, and my team members realized that. All we did was to channelize this energy towards delivering this train. We never thought that we were attempting something impossible. We knew it was difficult. We had to give 110% of what we were capable of. But that 110%, comes out of pride and ownership.
You heard Sudhanshu. India has world-class personnel both within and outside government. However, they need an enabling environment, and that is the most compelling aspect of the Train 18 story. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to Strat News Global on YouTube. Hit the bell icon so that you don't miss any updates. And please do share any thoughts and ideas with us. I'm available on Twitter at Capital Calculus. I'll be back next week with another episode. Till then, stay safe.